All right, welcome everybody to the 52nd Richmond Times-Dispatch Public Square, our initiative in civic discourse of issues of importance to the greater Richmond area and Virginia. I'm Tom Silvestri. I'm the publisher and the president of the Richmond Times-Dispatch and your moderator, and I wish they would turn the microphone down a little bit so I don't blow people's eardrums out. Test, test. Thank you. Today, a discussion with Senator Timothy M. Kaine, who has emerged as a leader in efforts to clarify how, when, and where America's military power is called into action. We invited Senator Kaine, and we're thankful he accepted our invitation, to an afternoon session, a rare afternoon session, the second one of the 52 public squares, to talk about the ideas for reforming our country's approach to war powers at a time when militant radical Islamists in the Middle East are on the rise, threatening our allies and perhaps, some say, our homeland. Among the big questions, what are the appropriate roles for the President and for the Congress? Just as a rule to gauge the audience, how many are here for their first time in a public square? Wow, we thank you for doing that. How many here for more than 5? Okay, you're the veterans. 10, you get life insurance here at the public square. Well, we appreciate you do that. You know the drill. The public square is a 90-minute conversation. They're all different. Sometimes we have debate. Sometimes we have panel conversation. We're just lucky to have a subject matter expert in this area to have a conversation. There are waters off to the side. What we'll do in this program is we'll open it up for Senator Kaine for him to talk about his work in Congress for about 30 minutes, and the rest of the program will be Q&A. If you stand up, wait for a microphone to come to you so you can properly identify yourself. By the way, how many people from Richmond here? Okay, home crowd for you. How many from Chesterfield? Henrico? Hanover? Outside the area? Goochland, okay, you're right. You check with we'll give you mileage on the way home. I'm sorry? Nottoway, wow, good. You might be anybody further than Nottoway? Wow, okay, well, welcome, thanks for coming in. And so that's basically the program. We also have it on good authority, Senator Kaine. We have another raging debate in the building with our comics. The newsroom tells me that your wife has voted, but you have not. Where do you stand on the comics issue? No,
keep Judge Parker.
Okay. Keep. Already voted. I hope the newsroom has solely noted. Comics is we could have a 50-hour marathon on the comics. Not today. So here's the setup. That would be another thing. If you can silence your cell phones also. We enjoy the ringtones, but they sort of disrupt everything. In a story that appeared in Monday's Times-Dispatch by staff writer Marcus Schmidt, the senator said he's open to hearing criticism and ideas for improving the overall of the War Powers Resolution. Quote, "I'm really curious about what folks have to say," he told Marcus. "I'm sure he's also interested in those who support his position. But just remember, the public square, you can be passionate, you can be emphatic, and you can be persuasive, but you got to be civil and respectful." Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Timothy McCain. Thank you.
I get that a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Hey, thank you guys. Thank you so much. What a delight to walk into a room and see so many friends from the very first day I moved to Richmond 30 years ago. I've got folks I knew the first day I was here and new friends too, and it's a treat to be with you and to be here for a rare midday public square. When they asked me a couple weeks ago to do this, I said, well, I can't do it at night because the Kansas City Royals will be playing in the World Series. And that seemed very unlikely to them, but here we are, a World Series game tonight against the Giants. I was sorry to see the editorial page opine the wrong way about their preference this morning, but it is a real treat to be here to talk about an issue that I'm really passionate about. And Tom, thank you for reading the particular quote from Marcus's piece about wanting comments, suggestions, criticism, because a bill that I've introduced with Senator McCain, our strategy was to introduce this bill in 2014 and use this year as sort of our intel gathering. We tried to make it as good as we could, but we felt like we needed to hear from a lot of people to make it better. And I've given a number of talks about this, and in every talk I'm most interested in the Q&A and the suggestions because they help us refine what has proven to be a difficult challenge. Okay, so let me jump into it. I want to talk about the law, the history, the problem, the fix, and then I want to say a concluding word about an underlying value that undergirds the entire discussion and that makes me really passionate about trying to get this question right. And the issue is the roles of the President and Congress in doing what I think is the hardest thing we should have to do in public life, and that is to initiate military action. I came into the Senate with a kind of obsession about this that started when I was Lieutenant Governor in 2002 and observed the debate about Iraq and the vote on the Iraq authorization. That vote was scheduled and called, and the debate occurred in public. I remember listening to it on NPR a few weeks before a midterm election in 2002. There was nothing about the situation in Iraq that required a debate before a midterm election. We didn't go into Iraq till March of 2003. But something about the way the topic was being approached, scheduled artificially before a midterm election, troubled me. And over time, I've kind of gotten into it deeper and deeper. I'm not an expert. I'm a layperson. I'm a lawyer. I've done some constitutional on my day. But I'm not an expert on this. I am a passionate layperson, and in that sense, I'm just like y'all. So, the law. The framers of the Constitution, as they grappled with the sort of the failure of the governmental arrangement from the end of the Revolutionary War to 1787, were trying to decide how to write a constitution that would establish checks and balances kind of in a couple of different directions. Checks and balances, legislative, judicial, executive, that was one part of the Constitution. But the check and balance they were also really trying to fix was between the federal and the state governments. The federal government was too weak in the early years of our country. They were trying to make a federal government that was strong, but that wouldn't just trample all over the states, which had been the primary powers. And so questions of the allocation of power were really very fundamental to virtually all of the clauses that were in the original Constitution that was done in 1787, then ratified by the states. The Constitution originally is filled with a number of clauses that you can put on a spectrum from super specific, you have to be 35 years old to be President of the United States, to super vague, you can't take somebody's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. What does that mean? You cannot subject somebody to cruel and unusual punishment. What does that mean? And the drafters of the Constitution, and it was primarily James Madison, was the lead drafter. He consulted with others, but he was the lead. They made very deliberate choices about when they would be specific and when they would be vague. On the specific to vague spectrum, the decisions about how war would begin are really over on the specific side. They're not on the vague side. There is a bit of ambiguity, but it's pretty specific. And it's specific in this way. Article 1, which is we love as legislators to say we're Article 1 and the President is Article 2. Article 1 says an enumerated power of Congress is Congress shall be the body that will declare war and budgetarily create a budget for defense and every other priority. Article 2, the executive article, says the President will be the commander-in-chief. And there's some other references in the two articles to military topics, but that's pretty much the allocation of power. Congress declares war. You cannot initiate a war without Congress, but once initiated, the President is the commander-in-chief, because the last thing you would want is 535 commanders-in-chief. So the simple understanding at the start was Congress would initiate and the President would implement and execute military matters. Very straightforward. That was a radical break from what governments had done before 1787. And the framers of the Constitution saw it as such. In a letter written about 10 years after the Constitution was passed, Madison described what he was thinking to Thomas Jefferson. And Madison said, and this is as good a direct quote as I can do from memory, it's very close, it may be a word or two off, but Madison wrote to Jefferson and said, our Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that it is the executive that is the branch of power most interested in war and thus most prone to it. It is for this reason that we with studied care have placed the question of war in the legislative branch. So Madison knew that there was a tendency to executive overreach generally, and specifically on questions of war. And when he was writing about the executive branch, Madison wasn't writing just about executives. There weren't that many executives. He was really writing about monarchs in 1797 when this letter was written. So in the U.S., we made a fundamental decision at the start of our kind of formation of government that questions of war would be wrested away from the monarch or the executive and put in the hands of the legislative branch. Thomas Jefferson, the recipient of that letter, faced an interesting challenge when he was president, as we now kind of are segueing from the law into the history. But we'll still show what the law was, because this was what was understood by those who were involved in framing the Constitution. Jefferson was dealing with a terrorist organization in the kind of the Middle Eastern region, the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. And they were not really a state actor as you would think of as a state. They were connected to a kind of caliphate that ran through North Africa, what today would be Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia. But the pirates were more like a terrorist organization. And the pirates were attacking American shipping interests in the Mediterranean in the early 1800s. Some of the ships that attacked would be commercial, some would be military ships. Jefferson, as the commander-in-chief, felt, in his understanding of this allocation, perfectly comfortable in ordering his commanders to repel attacks. Because as a commander-in-chief, the framers understood a commander's got to defend the nation, has to defend the nation. And he doesn't need Congress to defend the nation. Because remember, at this point, Congress would be in recess and would ride horseback, to Montpelier, Vermont. And so if something would happen, how could a president get Congress back? So there was an understanding in this difference between Congress declares war, the president's the commander-in-chief, that the president could act to defend against an imminent attack. American ships were being attacked in the Mediterranean. Jefferson was the commander-in-chief. He said, we can repel those attacks. And then we can repel attacks tomorrow. And then we can repel attacks the next day. But at some point, Jefferson said, this is getting kind of old. Just repelling attacks once they are occurring does not seem to be the right strategy. Why don't we go on offense against the Barbary pirates and try to destroy their ability to attack ships? And what Jefferson said was, once I have decided to go beyond the line of defense, I can't do it without the sanction of Congress. I have to have Congress to move from repelling an ongoing attack to strategizing about how to weaken the threat that the Barbary pirates present to American shipping interests. So the law is pretty clear. The law is pretty clear. Congress declares war, the president executes it. The president can act unilaterally before Congress in the event of repelling an imminent attack, but even in that circumstance, the framers believed that the president should come back and get Congress's assent, kind of a ratification of what was done. So that's the law. And again, we have so many vexing and challenging constitutional questions where the clauses are kind of vague, but this one's pretty specific. The history. The history is that almost as soon as the ink was dry, and whether it's been Whigs or Federalists, or Republicans or Democrats, and regardless of who controlled the Congress or who had the White House, we haven't followed the basic framework that the framers set up. Congress has declared war 5 times in the history of the United States. The president has initiated military action that would meet virtually anybody's definition of war 120 times. So 5 declarations of war, 120 initiations of military action by the president. Now, if you dig into the 120 plus, you will find that they're of a lot of different kinds. Sometime the president initiated and then Congress did come back, as in the case of the Korean conflict. I saw a Veterans Memorial yesterday that was erected in 1960 at a county courthouse that said it was in honor of the victims of World War II and the Korean conflict. So sometimes Congress has come back, even though they didn't declare war, and ratified a presidential action by a budgetary allocation or by some other legal action short of a declaration. But sometimes in that 120 instances of the president going first, Congress hasn't really done anything. And the most recent example of that before I get to my current hot topic, which is the war we are engaging against ISIL right now. The most recent example was President Obama using military force in connection with a NATO mission against Libya in 2011. Congress didn't authorize it. In fact, Congress, the House, censured the president for doing it without a congressional authorization. But this is a completely bipartisan thing. Republicans, Democrats, no matter who controls the Congress, who controls the House, the Madisonian concern has come to pass, and we see presidents initiating far more than Congress does. That's the history pretty quickly, 5 and 120. The problem. You know what? I should know the answer to that like that, and I don't, but the last was World War II. The last was World War II. World War I, World War II were the two in the 20th century, and then the others were before 1900. The problem. So one problem was the problem that Madison saw. Our Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrate, that is the executive, this branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. Executives overreach, and especially executives like to really puff out their chests about matters of war. And Madison saw that. That's one problem. He was accurate. Madison is such a superb and interesting public figure. We'd call him a flip-flopper today, actually. That's what we would call him, because when he was writing the Constitution, he started with the belief that we didn't need a Bill of Rights, and by the time he was done, partly for political reasons, but partly because he saw Baptist ministers being persecuted in Orange County, he came to believe that we needed a Bill of Rights to protect religious freedom and other freedoms. So since he started with a belief there wasn't a Bill of Rights and he came to believe that there was, we call him a flip-flopper today. So I love Madison. Sometimes flip-flops are fantastic. But Madison was right, but he was only half right. So he saw the problem of executive overreach. What he didn't see was that not only do executives overreach, but legislators want to avoid hard votes. Legislators want to avoid hard votes. And if I could actually assess culpability across our history, but especially right now, and I'm going to get to that in a minute with what's going on in, why haven't we had a vote of Congress about this mission against ISIL, which is a war? Why haven't we? More culpability is on Congress for wanting to avoid a hard vote. And Madison didn't see that as a danger, so he missed that. Now, those two pathologies, executive overreach and a congressional desire not to cast a hard vote, a vote on war is a hard vote. It's tough. Even if you're right, there's going to be a lot of horrible consequences. And if you're wrong, the consequences are sometimes too horrible to contemplate in terms of the sacrifices that you'll ask of people. And it might be unpopular, so you might lose an election, or your voters might be mad at you, or your constituents might, think weirdly of you. So Congress wants to avoid these votes if they can. Those two pathologies, overreach and abdication, have created the real problem, and the real problem is this. In our history, there's not been a clear practice for making this decision. Todd Culbertson, who's here, is going to be at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia tonight. They're doing a discussion on the war powers issue. They've been deeply involved in it, and I've used their research in proposing legislation. The Miller Center had a wonderful National War Powers Commission that they convened in like 06 and 07, and in their study of this question, they said, you know what, there has never been a golden age in the U.S. where we've kind of done it in a consistent way, had a decision that was made with the President and Congress kind of playing understood and consistent roles. There's not been a pattern in practice of any regular dialogue and decision in the most fundamental decision that government makes. And that's the problem. So I said I would talk about the problem. They're the two pathologies of overreach and abdication, but they create a problem, and the problem is no clear decision-making process in the most important decision we make. Now, I'm realistic about this fact. You can have the clearest decision-making process ever, and it will not make a decision about what to do against ISIL an easy decision. It will not make it easy to decide whether we should use military action to punish Bashar al-Assad for using chemical weapons against civilians in violation of the Geneva Convention. The clearest decision-making process will not make these questions easy, but I believe deeply that the absence of a clear decision-making process takes questions that are hard, very hard by themselves, and makes them even harder. And so for me, the fix has to involve coming up with a process that respects the constitutional prerogatives of the executive and legislative branch, but that normalizes the way we think about, talk about, debate, and vote on questions of war. There should be a norm. There should be a norm that presidents follow. There should be a norm that Congress will follow. There should be a norm that the American public can expect. There should be a norm that the men and women we ask to bear the battles and the burdens should have a right to expect. There should be a norm. We should do this in a way that puts the issues out on the table in a messy and contentious way. That's what democracy is, and in the process educates the public, and in the process leads to a decision. The fix. I'm involved right now in 3 interlocking efforts to tackle this problem of how do the executive and legislative make a decision to initiate military action. One is a short-term one is a medium-term one is a long-term one. So let me talk about them. The short-term one is, what do we do about the war we're in against ISIL right now? Chuck Hagel's called it a war. We are in a war against ISIL, our Secretary of Defense. The President and others have used that phrase. President Obama, in an interview on Meet the Press, said, I started to defend the nation, but now we need to go on offense against ISIL. He used exactly the phraseology that Jefferson used against the Barbary pirates, where Jefferson said, once I go from defense to offense, I got to have the sanction of Congress. We are at war with ISIL. So the short-term thing I'm working on is I am trying to give the White House as much hell as I can, and my congressional colleagues as much hell as I can, about the need to have a debate and vote in Congress about this mission, whether the nation supports it, the extent of it, and then allow the president to be the commander-in-chief and execute it. I started into this debate on this short-term issue in a very agitated way, because in the middle of June, when the ISIL threat was kind of starting to roll, the president had Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, and Nancy Pelosi to the White House, and he sat down with them to talk about the threat that ISIL posed, what he might have to do. And they walked out of the Oval Office, and they walked right to the mic on the lawn of the White House, and they said, this is a serious threat, and the president has all the power he needs to do exactly what he wants. And I read that, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. That the president has all the power he needs? Where is that power? Where is that power? We had been told by intel officials that while ISIL poses a significant threat to the United States, it is not an imminent threat. There's no intel suggesting imminent attack against the United States. So the commander-in-chief ability to defend against attacks would not authorize this war. The commander-in-chief's constitutional ability as commander-in-chief to defend against imminent attack does not cover, bombing at a dam in Mosul to try to take the dam back from ISIL when that dam is hundreds of miles from a U.S. embassy or consulate. So there's not a constitutional power of imminent self-defense. There are 2 existing authorizations that were passed by Congress right after the 9/11 attack and then the 2002 Iraq authorization, but as I read those, neither the wording nor the overbroad interpretation of them that both administrations subsequently have adopted, nor the intent of the members of Congress who voted for them, would cover this action against ISIL. And the president's own words again about both of these authorizations, going back even a few months, would suggest that it doesn't cover these. So I have been really leaning on the White House and my congressional colleagues. I sat down and wrote an op-ed that day that was in the Washington Post on the 25th of June. Just so happened to appear, I basically said, congressional leadership is wrong and the White House is wrong. There's no authority to do this without a vote of Congress, a fresh vote of Congress. Just so happened to appear the day that a bunch of us were going to the White House for a cocktail party, and I wasn't the most popular guy at the cocktail party. But the interesting thing was, I was much less popular with my colleagues than I was with the president. The president actually is a constitutional lawyer, and he sees this kind of like I do. But what he had was the leaders of Congress basically not just saying, you have the power you want. He had them saying, don't come to us. We got a midterm election coming up. even members of Congress who are suing the president right now, claiming that he's using imperial executive powers to do things. They're saying, but oh, by the way, on this question of war, go do whatever you want and don't ask us to vote on it. And so I have, frankly, had more challenges with my colleagues on this one than I've had with the White House. I have introduced an authorization for military action against ISIL that basically tracks the 4 key pillars that the president laid out in his speech in early September. Humanitarian assistance, that's not controversial. The U.S. is the biggest humanitarian relief provider in the world, and we're proud of that, and we're going to continue to do that, and that's not controversial. But the 3 military pieces that are airstrike campaign in Iraq and Syria, counterterrorism operations against ISIL leadership, and then providing assistance and training and arms to ground troops from the region, whether it's the Iraqi army, the Kurdish Peshmerga, or appropriate opposition forces in Syria. So I've introduced a bill to authorize that, but with key limitations, a sunset clause, a repeal of the 2002 Iraq authorization so that it's not floating out there as a separate authorization, a narrow prohibition against combat troops on the ground, as U.S. combat troops on the ground for ground operations in Iraq or Syria, except under certain specified circumstances. So I've introduced that bill, and I'm encouraging my colleagues, we got to have a debate and vote about this. The odds were bad for me for a while in September. I was being told that wasn't going to happen because the president has all the power he needs. But I do believe that the will, and we'll see, this is to be determined. I think the will in Congress has now switched over to, no, we have to debate and vote upon this. It's not going to happen as quick as I would like. I thought, why would we adjourn on the 18th of September, which is the second earliest recess before a midterm election since 1960, with a war underway that Virginians and others are serving in? Why would we adjourn without debating about this? But instead, it was the wisdom of the greater body. No, we're not going to take this up now, but I do think Congress is now in a position in both houses, in both parties, where they understand that the scope of this mission is such that there will have to be a fresh debate and vote. And we are anxious to get to that, and it will happen, I believe, sometime between the middle part of November and the 11th of December. That's the short-term thing, trying to get this one right. A medium-term thing is this. The authorization that Congress passed after the attacks of 9/11 is out there. 13 years later, it's still being used to justify drone strikes in Yemen and Somalia and Mali, and certainly in other theaters, the original theaters of Afghanistan, Pakistan. We had a hearing before the Armed Services Committee in May of 2013, and I asked Obama administration witnesses, I said, okay, so I've looked at this authorization. How long is this war going to go on? Because there's no sunset clause to it. And one of the administration witnesses said, probably another 25 or 30 years. He didn't say it with any sense of irony or, that anybody would find that objectionable. That's just the fact. Because the authorization was so open-ended, it's 60 words, basically allows the United States to go after the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks or those that harbored or assisted them. Both administrations have added a gloss to it that says, well, what that means is you can go after Al-Qaeda or any group that is associated with Al-Qaeda, so long as that group intends harm to the United States or its coalition partners. How many coalition partners did we have in the war in Afghanistan? 59. 59. So I asked the same witnesses who had said this is going to go on for 25 or 30 years, I said, so under this, your interpretation of the current authorization, if somebody is born in 2025 in Denmark or Montenegro, and they join a splinter group that claims an affiliation with Al-Qaeda, and they intend harm to that government, they have no interest in harming the United States. You're telling me that what Congress did on September 1401 allows us to take military action against that person and that group? And they said, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to go into the post-9/11 authorization and dramatically refine and limit it. There are some areas where it might need to be broadened a bit in terms of maybe not just Al-Qaeda, but what about the Al-Nusra Front? What about ISIL? What about Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb or the Haqqani network in Pakistan? It may need to be broadened a little bit, but it also needs to be made much more specific. And in that effort, revising the post 9/11 authorization to take action against non-state terrorist organizations, the White House is doing good work with bipartisan senators to try to figure out what is the right way to refine that. But the big picture fix, back to the problem is we don't have a norm for making these decisions. The big picture fix is to go into the War Powers Resolution in 1973 and rewrite it. That is the current kind of statutory law that is supposed to trigger the back and forth between the President and Congress, and it's never worked. It's never worked. In fact, evidence of it not working can be seen even in the past week. War Powers Resolution was an outgrowth of frustration of members of Congress about this very thing. This is a debate that's been going on a long time. The President and Congress, the tug of war about how we do war. And in the middle of the Vietnam conflict, not a declared war, but a conflict that Congress had ratified, President Nixon began military actions in Cambodia and Laos without telling Congress. So this was a war that Congress had approved, sort of after the fact, not by formal declaration war, but they had approved it. But they hadn't approved action in Cambodia and Laos. President Nixon began it without telling them. Congress reacted very negatively, passed a War Powers Resolution to require more in-depth consultation between Congress and the President. President Nixon vetoed it. The veto was overridden by a two-thirds majority in both houses, and President Nixon and every president since, Democrat and Republican, have taken the position that the law is unconstitutional. There are a variety of arguments as to why it is unconstitutional. The constitutionality of it has never been affirmatively tested all the way up to the Supreme Court, because the court tends to stay out of questions about war powers allocation between Congress and the United States. But most, constitutional scholars, right, left, and center, would say there are a couple pieces of it that are probably not constitutional. There are things, for example, in the law where Congress can take steps that a president can't veto, and that probably violates the ability of a president to veto, then subject to override. So there's some problems with war powers. Just in the last 10 days, the weakness, presidents don't really follow the War Powers Resolution, and the weakness of it was seen with this. When President Obama started the airstrike campaign in Syria in August 8th, Iraq and Syria on August 8th against ISIL, he sent a letter to Congress pursuant to the War Powers Resolution. I'm sending you this notice. I'm doing these things. I can do them for 60 days without Congress affirmatively weighing in, but if you don't weigh in within 60 days, I have to stop. Well, let's see. 60 days ran earlier this month, and we're still going on. And the president was asked, his team were asked about that last week, and he says, no, I'm relying on my constitutional powers and the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs. President Obama is doing exactly what other executives have done, which is they sort of half follow it and give Congress notice, but then they claim many of the limits on them are unconstitutional. So Senator McCain and I, the big term fix is come up with a norm. And I'm going to say this and then say one word about the value that underlies the whole thing and take questions. Come up with a norm for discussion, debate, and voting that will help us make the best decisions we can, and in the process educate the American public about what's at stake. John McCain and I introduced a bill in early 2013 that we were working with a group of colleagues on to improve, called the War Powers Consultation Act of 2014. And the bill is a shameless crib of work that was done at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. The Miller Center convened a panel of experts on war powers issues in 2006. The panel was chaired by Warren Christopher, former Democratic Secretary of State, Jim Baker, former Republican Secretary of State. It had former Republican legislator Slate Gorton of Washington, a senator, and Lee Hamilton, Democrat member of Congress from Indiana. Had historians. Doris Kearns Goodwin was the historian that worked with them on the effort. Had former diplomats, White House officials, Ed Meese, Attorney General, and Abner Mikva, a White House counsel who was also a federal appellate court judge and a legislator. It was an A-list panel by every estimation, and they looked at the history and they wrote the report and they said there's been no norm, there's no golden era, we've never gotten this right, we're not doing it like the framers intended. And they proposed a draft statute that in this day of, the Affordable Care Act is thousands of pages long, this thing is like 3.5 pages long. It's really an amazing piece of work. And it was done by scholars, but also people who'd had to grapple with these questions in the White House and Congress. And the War Powers Consultation Act basically does three things. After it repeals the 1973 Act, and it replaces it, and it does three things. First, it grapples with, what's war? I mean, what is war in the 21st century when we've got drones? What is war in a 21st century where, with the press of a computer button, you can hijack somebody's financial sector or a power grid without using ground troops or airstrikes or anything, cyber attacks? What's war in a time where some of the most significant challenges we face are not nation states? You know, at least give Vladimir Putin this. He's doing war the old-fashioned way, right? You know, it's a state. What do we do about the state of Russia? But no, the biggest challenges we face in these days are not really challenges that were that foreseen, which is these non-state organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIL. So the first issue we tackle is sort of what is war, and we come up with a functional definition. And all of this is subject to revision and improvement. That's why I want to get to questions. If you're going to use American military assets in a military rather than a humanitarian, it's not typhoon relief in a military mission for more than 7 days, that's war that would trigger all these consultation requirements. So that's kind of the basic definition we come up with. The second issue the fixed bill deals with is, what is consultation? You'll hear a president say, I consulted with Congress. Now, when you see any president say that, that could mean everything from, I convened all the relevant committee chairs. There's 8 committees, 4 in each house, and I got the leaders, majority and minority both, in the House leadership, and I talked about what to do. But usually what it means is I consulted with Congress. I called 2 or 3 people I thought were going to agree with me, and I talked to them about it, and they told me that, Mr. President, we're all behind you. And so the second piece of the bill defines what consultation is. It establishes a committee in the Senate, a bicameral committee, Senate and House, bipartisan, 20 members, consultation committee that is a permanent committee with permanent staff. The White House is required to just be in permanent dialogue with that committee about all the hot spots and challenges in the world that might lead to a need for military action. And the ongoing relationship between the White House and that committee would, by definition, be consultation. And the third part of the bill is the voting requirement. When military action begins, how Congress in both houses has to be on the board, voting yea or nay. You know, and basically the framework would be, if the president decides I've been talking to my consultation committee and this hot spot is emerging, we've got to use military action, gives a report to the consultation committee. I want to use military action to handle this threat in this way. The consultation committee then introduces a resolution to support the president's mission as described in the report of X day to the consultation committee. It gets introduced, it gets sent to the Foreign Relations Committee in both houses, and there's a requirement for debate and voting just as any other bill. But it gets a preference in terms of the speed with which it goes through both houses. So those are the basic pieces of the bill, but you can adjust the definition of war, you can adjust the consultation committee, you can adjust the voting days, should it be 30, should it be 45, but the bottom line is what we're looking for is a norm. A decision-making process that people can count on that will educate members of Congress and educate the public and make people accountable for a decision. Last thing I'll say, the value. I'm not doing this just because of the Constitution. Now that would be reason enough to do it. That would be reason enough to do it. But there's a value that underlies the Constitution that's the reason I'm doing it. And you can tease this out if you look at the writings of Madison and Jefferson. George Mason played a huge role in the debate about this clause when it came to the floor during the debates about the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. The value is this. In war, you're going to ask people to sacrifice their life, their health, physical, their mental health. Maybe the trauma of they're fine, but seeing something happen to their friends. Maybe they're fine and nothing happens to their friends, but in war, you might kill civilians. Go look at how many Iraqi civilians were killed in the Iraq War. That's going to have an effect on you. When I was governor and commander-in-chief of the Virginia Guard, I went to a lot of deployments and homecomings and wakes and funerals. And I went to visit our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I had two members of my cabinet, one whose son came home at the end of a tour of duty, just about done, horrible IED explosion, came home with a whole series of significant disabilities that years later are still causing huge impacts in this young man's life. I had another member of my cabinet whose son was in the Corps at Virginia Tech and then went overseas, deployed in, I think, both Iraq and Afghanistan, came home but with no physical injury, but with significant mental health issues. We're asking people to sacrifice. We're asking people to do things that will affect them the rest of their lives. Even when we did an airstrike campaign in the Balkans, only airstrikes, nothing on the ground, because we're already on the ground in Iraq and Syria in limited ways, but the Balkans, airstrikes only, we lost people, we had people captured. There's no such thing as a war where there's no consequence on the people that you're asking to bear the burden. You all know this. Virginians know this. So it just seems to me, and I think this is what the whole thing was about, getting Congress to weigh in and debate before war is initiated. If we're going to ask people to sacrifice, then we ought to at least do the work to say this is in the national interest. And we all stand up and say this is in the national interest. So then the people who are out there battling know that the American public has said this is worth it. Because if we don't do that, and it's like, well, I don't want to do this for a midterm. I don't want to cast a vote. It's going to be unpopular. I don't know what the right thing is. I'd rather not cast a vote because I'm not sure what the right answer is. Well, how dare we send people out and make them sacrifice maybe everything when, like, we haven't been willing to cast a yes or no vote about whether it's worth it. And if we do have the debate and we ask the tough questions, and usually what that leads to is some refinement of the mission. The president will put something on the table, and it tends to get refined in a helpful way, and we're behind it, and we say this is in the national interest. Then the people that we're asking to bear the burden and go into the battle and sacrifice, at least they've got that behind them. And that consensus is much less likely to fray. Imagine being over, fighting some war and then watching a whole bunch of people who never voted on it to begin with, now starting to gripe and say, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. I can't believe why'd the president do this? Imagine the morale effect that would have on you if you're going to sacrifice everything. So that is the value that underlies the whole thing. Congress set it up not just to wrest power away from the monarchies of the past, but it was set up in the Constitution because war is sober. War should be the most difficult thing we do. George Mason said these clauses were designed to be not a facilitator of war, but a facilitator of peace and a clogger of war. But when war is necessary, and we know that it is, then let's say it and let's stand behind it and say it's necessary and at least give those who are asking to sacrifice the benefit of that. So that's the law, the problem, the law, the history, the problem, the fix, and a little bit of the value, and I'd love to answer your questions or take your suggestions.
We're going to test your curious streak just for the answer of the power of Google. I may need a second source on that. The 5 wars, War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, and the 2 World Wars. Okay.
Good work.
Right. Good work. No PolitiFact needed. Okay, we got 2 microphones, Bob Rayner and Paige Mudd. Here's the drill. Given the size of the crowd, and we want to end at 2 o'clock, you can hold your comments to about 3 minutes in deference to trying to get as many comments as possible. Questions are great. If you keep your comments to a salient point, 1 point, because there's a pretty good choice that somebody else in the room may make your other points. If nobody else raises their hand, we'll come back to you if you have a second point. Deal? Deal. Okay. Well, I got at least 1 deal. Okay. Who's first? Start. Who's got the mics? Bob?
Got 'em.
Go. Paige, Bob.
And you say your name first.
I'm Jay Ibsen.
Hey, Jay.
And I've experienced war. The thing that I would like to know, we know ISIS is a problem, a big problem. And I know you're doing the right thing. But what about the gap in between? We're not riding on camels and donkeys anymore. Things over there are happening rapidly. We've already got some of ISIS people right here in our country. We know they are here. What can we do in the meantime before you can get your colleagues off their butt and make a decision that if we don't stop them over there, they're going to be over here?
Jay, thank you for that question. And obviously, I'm sure that that's what the president grappled with. What's the likelihood that I can get Congress to take this up when the leadership is telling me, do not bring this to us? And he felt a need to act. And so there is action going on right now. I was in Qatar last week, and I visited the center where the airstrikes are being coordinated by the U.S. and all the coalition partners. And it was fascinating to be in that room and see all these representatives from all these nations trying to make decisions about, do we have enough intel that would suggest this is the right place to do an airstrike, and how do we minimize civilian casualties? So those things are happening, and the president is showing no signs of waiting for Congress. I think he should have. I think he should have insisted that Congress not recess and stayed, but nevertheless, he is taking the actions and asserting his ability to do so. There are other things we're doing. So on the question of foreign fighters returning to the U.S., I've been overseas twice in the last 2 months to the Middle East, and everywhere I go, Tunisia, Morocco, Pakistan, India, Qatar, Afghanistan, the talk about the foreign fighters, which we'd seen, the foreign fighters that fought the Soviets in Afghanistan fanned out everywhere. We're seeing foreign fighters who were in Syria and Iraq coming back into other countries. We have to do a better job of tracking them. We've stopped some from going over. We've stopped some from coming back. But there are probably some legal changes we need to make to enable us to track passports even a little bit better, to make sure that we can monitor folks who've been over in that theater, and if need be, stop them from coming into the country.
Question on the left.
Yeah.
My name is Dale F. Jones, and I'm just a citizen. But I have contacted your office and Senator Warner's office, and I want just a straightforward answer. When we knew we were going to go to war with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, why we didn't declare war? I asked you specifically in a letter to enter a bill to declare war.
I have done that.
No, you didn't. You entered a bill to do something different.
I hear you. Okay.
And it's simple. If Congress won't do its duty, all these other norms and changes in the War Power Act isn't going to cure that. The problem is you and Congress.
Well, no, I have introduced a bill. Now, I will say my bill is an authorization for use of military force. That is the phrase that we use now to declare war. I don't think we need to just kind of rest on a phrase. And so an authorization for use of military force is a declaration of war. I have introduced that bill. I have a couple of co-sponsors to it, and that bill, along with 3 others, are going to be debated in the Foreign Relations Committee when we return. But since June, I have been making the very argument you have made, and I agree. The problem of executive overreach wouldn't exist without congressional abdication. And the bill that I have put in with Senator McCain, and he and I have worked on it a lot, but we want to make it better, would essentially force congressional voting in this instance.
I wish you luck, but we got good men there. We got good men in Congress now, and you run away from doing your duty. That's what you got 535 people up there that are doing nothing, and the country is in a war now, and we got to support it. It's too late to debate it, but in the future.
I hear you, but I don't think it's too late to debate it.
Question behind you. Over here. This first.
Yeah.
Arthur Venable, Richmond, Virginia. I'm a veteran Vietnam. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Arthur.
You've got your work cut out for you. I'm a supporter. I'm not going to throw any trick questions at you. I think the American public would like to see who our allies are. You mentioned 59. I practically fell off my chair. I would like to see in the Muslim world what Muslim countries are supporting us. I read somewhere Saudi Arabia was allowing us to use their airfields. I'd like to see what the Muslim countries are giving in manpower and dollars. I would like to see what the Western countries in Europe, Great Britain, Spain, Germany, what Canada, what Australia are giving individually in dollars and in manpower. And then I'd like to see what America is giving in dollars and manpower. If it was published in the Times-Dispatch, I didn't see it. But if you could get this information to the Times-Dispatch, and you can put this, because you have articles every day on ISIS and ISIL, I think it would help Americans decide. I have written to you like the other gentleman. You've responded. It's a boilerplate response, which I understand. But I think the citizens need to know what our commitment may be.
I couldn't agree more with this. And actually, that's one of the reasons why we ought to be having a debate. How do you get how do newspapers run stories about who's in the coalition? How do newspapers run stories about what's the cause? The administration comes forward with a plan, and then in the Foreign Relations Committees, we pepper them with questions. We ask those questions, and they have to answer them. And if they don't answer them, then they don't get the vote they want, and then that's disseminated to the public. But when the president just initiates on its own and Congress says, oh, we don't want to vote, then these questions don't get aired. Now, the other thing I'll point out, I think it's very important in this campaign against ISIL that there be huge participation from regional players. If a region won't police its own extremism, we can't do it, period. There's no amount of ground troops that the United States can put into Iraq and Syria that will beat ISIL if the region won't stand up to its own extremism. And that is one of the reasons behind the president's plank in this 4-point mission, or his limitation of no American troops on the ground for combat operations. Because what he is saying is, look, can we help? Sure we can. Train, assist, advise, provide arms, airstrikes. But if the Iraqi security forces or the Kurdish Peshmerga or the opposition in Syria are not willing to engage in ISIL on the ground, we'll support them if they will. But if they're not willing to do it, there's nothing the U.S. can do that will enable us to beat ISIL in Iraq and Syria. We can keep ISIL from attacking us in the U.S., but we can't beat them in Iraq and Syria if the regional actors are not willing to do it. So that is a very fair question. And when we get to the debate, one of the virtues maybe of waiting until we have the vote, I've been advocating for a vote right away, but I've heard a counter from a couple of my colleagues, and they say, look, I may vote yes if there's a real coalition, including nations from the region, but I may vote no if there's not. And so let's see what the administration can do to pull together the real coalition. And if there is a true coalition and the region's going to stand up against extremism, then I'll be a supporter. But if not, I'm going to vote no. So we will see how that develops as we get into the debate.
Bob, you got a question on the left?
Oh yeah.
Senator Kaine, I'm Adria Scharf. I'm the director of the Richmond Peace Education
Hey, Adria.
Center. Good
Nice to see you.
I want to thank you for your leadership on this issue. This discussion is very much overdue, and I do appreciate your efforts to restore constitutional balance. And if we as a society have learned anything from our wars of the past 13 years, I would hope that one lesson that we've learned very clearly is that our wars can be very unpredictable. We were promised or told that the 2003 war in Iraq would be a short foray, affordable foray, and that war turned out to have horrific costs, both to our own society, our troops, and to the Iraqi people. So democratic deliberation is so important, as our founders understood and as you understand. My question has to do with the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, which you talked about, which was passed in the wake of 9/11. Congress, wanted to protect our country from additional terrorist attacks. But this law has really become a legal blank check for the war on terror. And you talked about how it's provided cover for drone strikes and strikes in Yemen, Somalia, elsewhere. The American people don't realize that in addition, that law is also the legal justification for things like warrantless wiretapping and indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay. I believe that we need a serious course correction in our war on terror. And that piece of legislation, in addition...
Can you ask your question, please?
Yes, absolutely. That piece of legislation has eroded civil liberties in addition to providing cover for war. How does your proposed legislation affect that law? I believe we need a full repeal of that law, and we need to start from scratch. Interested in your opinion.
So I talked a little bit about the 2001 authorization. In the days right after 9/11, Congress passed a 60-word military authorization, no geographic limits, no temporal limits. And that has been used in many countries for the 13 years since. And we have learned a lot of lessons. And the lessons we've learned should cause us to shrink it. But you're right. It is that law that is led not only to military action, the drone strikes, but it is the fundamental piece of law that is keeping Guantanamo open. And while we have concerns about some of the wiretapping programs, et cetera, that are subject to separate statutes, I have long argued that most of those statutes really have their origins in an open-ended declaration of war, and that you could fix the NSA wiretapping processes or think you have fixed them, but if you leave an open-ended declaration of war, you haven't really fixed them. The best thing to do is to go upstream and try to refine this open-ended declaration of war to really focus on it. So my bill with Senator McCain does not tackle that, but my medium-term issue, also I'm working with Senator McCain and a group of about a dozen, is to take that authorization and significantly change it. Now, we are not proposing its complete repeal until we come up with the replacement, and we've been working to determine the replacement. I think I can say this, and I'll speak for myself, not for my colleagues, as we think about what is the appropriate military authorization to deal with terrorist groups. So President Bush asked for a particular authorization right after 9/11. He said, give me the power to unilaterally go after terrorist groups that mean harm to the United States. And Congress overwhelmingly rejected that. Even after this horrible attack where emotions were high and we definitely wanted to respond, Congress wouldn't give that broad power. But there is a legal process within the State Department for designating a foreign terrorist organization. That is, if an organization meets certain criteria, it can be administratively designated as a foreign terrorist organization. That has some consequences in trade and other things. We're looking at that law and thinking whether that might have an analog over in the defense side, but not an administrative designation. So, for example, a terrorist organization that meets certain criteria in terms of planning to carry out attacks against the United States, if the White House were to come and say, okay, this is this organization, here's the intel, they mean us harm, and we were to vote on it, we could authorize military action against that group. Not a broadly defined group of all their partners, anybody they're associated with, but with that group. And that authorization would probably have a sunset. It would have to be re-upped to determine whether the group is still a threat. And if the administration decided, wow, we said Al-Qaeda, but now it's ISIL that's the problem, or it's the Haqqani network that's the problem, they would have to come back to Congress to add a group by congressional vote, not administratively, by congressional vote to this. So we are looking at what we would consider a legal framework for military action against non-state terrorist organizations that would model in some way on this State Department foreign terrorist organization law, but that would require a vote of Congress to add a group and that would have some kind of sunset and review provision.
Pages on the left. The left side of the room is winning over the right side, so Bob's moved over to the right side just in case the room doesn't tilt over once in a while. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Welcome.
Good to hear from you, Senator Kaine. My name is Anna Strohmeyer. I'm a student here at VCU in Richmond.
Go Rams.
I'm studying international social justice, so I have a bit of a stake in this. My question and comment, I guess, is that right now I sense that there's a lot of confusion for our country and many countries that are sensing a terrorist threat from ISIL. Because mainly, as one gentleman put it in a video, he said, he was a veteran of World War II, and he said, don't go in the armed forces. Like, no matter how much you feel like you can get glory or whatever, or you can get a status, don't go in the armed forces, because when I was fighting, even though it was so terrible, the enemy wore a uniform. I knew who my enemy was. Yeah. But today, the enemy is specifically trying to blend in with the background and not be, present and known. Well, my question would be that, taking into account the fact that we don't know exactly who it is, drone strikes that we're doing right now, in the place of boots on the ground, the drone strikes are based on a reasonable threat, like any person or any individual that is a reasonable threat according to the executive group. For them, it's anybody. It's like a blank check, like anyone that they even consider maybe might be a terrorist. They could kill that person, and then later they could just say, oh, it was a reasonable threat, even if that was just a civilian. So what would our response be? Because literally right now we have armed forces.
Can you ask your question? I sense there's a question coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have armed
think I get
forces
you.
that we
Yeah.
could deploy. We have our allies' armed forces. But how would we deal with this, threat that comes from many different sources?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in that question. So the first piece is right. I mean, military service under these conditions and these times is very, very tough. I was with a group of Vietnam-era vets yesterday, and they were saying, we think the people who are serving right now are heroes, because as hard as our service was and as unappreciated as we weren't doing 4 and 5 and 6 deployments. I mean, we weren't doing that. This guy who was telling me this, he said, I was there for 13 months, and it was the toughest 13 months of my life. But I wasn't going back, and then going back, and then going back. And so it is a tough circumstance. And Vietnam had this component to it, too. There is a lot of the enemy is not, they're not standing up and saying, we're your enemy. ISIL's completely changed. They were going around proudly and with the flag until the airstrike campaign started. Now they're not doing that anymore. They're blending in a lot more, and it does make it more difficult. But the good news is, whether people think that's a reason not to join the service, you go to a graduation of a boot camp graduation or an officer's graduation, whatever, and you see a whole lot of people who signed up and volunteered. And you see that they volunteered in year 13 of the longest war in the history of the United States. And they're still volunteering and doing it with a pride and a smile on their face, and they're excited to serve their country. So the difficult circumstances is not stopping people wanting to serve, which thank God for that. The drone issue is a tough one. I mean, it's a very, very tough one. Now, drones are not all bad. If you look at the drone, the civilian casualty ratio to finding the target that really is going to do you harm, I believe that the drone civilian casualty ratio is less than a lot of the way conventional warfare is waged. However, there are examples and bad examples that are then laid on the table as they should be of strikes that win amiss. That happens in all war. Mm-hmm. But I'll just conclude and say this. I think we won't be able to get a drone policy right until we get right the declaration of what is the war that we're fighting. Mm-hmm. And if we get that right, then we can have a discussion about how drones should be utilized in that mission. But we're fuzzy on the mission now. And that's the main problem, and it'll be easier to solve the drone question if we get clear on the mission.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah, I would just like to quickly say that I understand that the civilian to target ratio is very low comparatively to other things like Hiroshima, let's say. But the thing is
even, just even conventional bombing.
Right. But the issue is that the targets themselves are, people in the administration have said they don't know who the target exactly is, but they were a threat. They just considered them a threat, and thus they were killed. And there's a lot of gray area in who they're targeting and why they're targeting those people.
I can't say things that I know from classified settings, but what I will say generally is the degree of care in focusing on targeting and having it be the right target, not the wrong target, and the right target at a time when they're not surrounded by innocent civilians is very, very high. But that doesn't mean that no civilians are lost, and it doesn't mean that mistakes aren't made. But the degree of care in the targeting, I have found it to be there's a great deal of effort to try to get targeting right.
Okay. The assembly from the right side of the room has risen.
Senator, thanks for your leadership on this. One of the things you haven't mentioned is I believe that our
You state your name, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Brad Armstrong.
Brad.
I believe that one of the things that will benefit from this leadership, if it's successful, is that our standing in the world will be improved if we are more deliberate about these things.
Yes.
And I think that is no small deal.
Mm-hmm.
2 quick questions. One, I'm confused, and I think a lot of other people are confused about the difference between an authorization for force and a declaration of war. I'd always thought that a declaration of war was on a specific country and authorization for force was on something less specific. But can you help us with that?
Sure.
And second, how do we prevent the politicization, I guess,
yeah.
of this issue in Congress? Can you really force a vote in a quick enough period of time that it will not tie the administration's hands?
for my purposes, and maybe now this is an insider thinking after 2 years, declaration of war, authorization for use of military force are exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And I like authorization for use of military force a little bit better because I think some, even the military, they don't know whether a cyber attack that takes our grid down, I cross-examine them about this in hearings, they're not sure whether that's war or not. But it is clearly a use of military force to mean us harm. And so I'd say, look, we can use military force, and that to me is a declaration of war. So I use the phrases interchangeably, and I don't know why it is that Congress decided with Korea that they didn't want to call it a war, they wanted to call it a conflict, and similar in Vietnam, and now we use authorization for use of military force. So I don't know why the terms have evolved, but they're exactly the same thing. And a president shouldn't be able to say, well, I need Congress for war, but this is just military force. I don't need Congress for that. Using military force in any significant way, whether you call it a war or not, Congress has got to vote on it. The politicization question. I'm happy to tell you that in the Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committee where I serve, we're quite nonpartisan. We're often divided, so I cast a vote to use airstrikes in a limited way against the Assad government to try to deter them from using chemical weapons against civilians. It was a 10-8 vote in the Foreign Relations Committee, a 10-8 vote. But it was a nonpartisan vote. It wasn't partisan at all. They're divided because these are hard questions. They're tough. But generally, armed services and foreign relations act in a more nonpartisan way. Not completely, but in a more nonpartisan way. Your question probably really is, though, the question that I think it was Mr. Jones asked earlier, which is, can you set up a structure that cannot be avoided by members of Congress who have no backbone? And that was his challenge to me. And we've had a structure. We got a really good structure. And then we had a War Powers Resolution in 1973, and it had some problems, but it's a structure. The structure hasn't been followed because people haven't been willing to have the backbone to follow it. Now, Senator McCain and I, we come at these questions in a pretty different way, and we agree on how they would be used in some instances and disagree on others. But we both agree strongly, don't duck a hard vote, embrace the hard vote. That's why you're there. John McCain has never met a vote that he thought was hard, the last hearing I was at with Senator McCain, he was cross-examining Secretary Kerry like crazy on the ISIL threat and complaining about everything Kerry was doing. And Kerry said something self-deprecating or funny about how McCain was so combative. And he goes, yeah, but I got tough questions. And John goes, oh, no, Senator McCain, I know you well. I know you think that a fight not joined is a fight not enjoyed. So Senator McCain and I come at these a lot differently, but we both believe strongly that we're there to cast hard votes. And if we're not willing to, then we should be doing something else. And especially on this, because if the consequences of ducking this responsibility is putting people at risk without having the confidence to know that the nation's behind them.
But can you force a vote in a limited amount of time?
The bill that we have, the Part 3, the timing requirements, forces a vote in a limited amount of time. But Mr. Jones is saying, won't people still figure out a way to get around it? And that's the open question. But at least we can fix the unconstitutional aspects that have always plagued the War Powers Resolution from being embraced either by Congress or the President. Yes. Steve.
I know that I want to focus on the values because I think that's so important. Do you think that if more people had served who are in the Congress, that the situation would be different?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Let me tell you, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Here is a big picture worry that I have about where we are right now. So, when there was a draft, men would serve. Women would volunteer to serve, but men would all be subject to draft. And so everybody kind of had skin in the game. And members of Congress, their kids would serve. So here is the worry I have in 2014 about the way we do these war issues. Big picture. If a war can start without a vote of Congress, if members of Congress haven't served, I haven't served, if members of Congress, probably 10 out of 535, have kids in the military, now here's a great one, if members of Congress figured out in Iraq and Afghanistan what they had never figured out before, which is we can put the whole thing on the credit card. We can put the whole thing on the credit card. Even Vietnam, as unpopular as it was, we taxed ourselves to pay for a chunk of it. Now, there was still some deficit spending, but we taxed ourselves to pay for a chunk of it. So if I don't serve, and if my kids don't serve, and if I don't have to cast a vote, and if I can put it on the credit card, and actually, maybe I can outsource it to Blackwater or a bunch of contractors to do a big chunk of it. And that's a contract. That's not a declaration of war. We're just writing a contract with somebody. I worry that there's a whole series of things that are basically, like outsourcing the responsibility. This is supposed to be the gravest responsibility. But there's a whole series of things, and most of them are kind of recent inventions, that have led to a situation where the grave responsibility can kind of be outsourced or abdicated. And I think that that is something we should deeply worry about. We should make this tough, and we should make it, the president should be able to defend the nation immediately without even coming to Congress if we're under imminent attack. But if we're going to go on offense, we should make it a tough, deliberative process where we ask hard questions, where we answer the questions about cost, and we answer the questions about who the allies are, and we should do all of that, and then we should have a vote, and then we should live by the result. If we have this vote on my bill in ISIL, and we don't support it, I'm going to be disappointed, because I do think ISIL is a significant enough threat to warrant use of military force with limitations. But if we have the debate and it's voted down, I'm going to be disappointed, but I'm going to live with the vote, because it's better to have the debate and have the vote and lose than it is to just do it without, I guess I'm kind of getting my way with the president doing this without a vote, because I do think ISIL's a threat. But I don't want to get my way. I want it to be done the right way. If it's important enough to be done, it's important enough to do it the right way.
Right side.
Hey, Randy.
Senator Kaine, my name's Randy Rollins. I'm going to raise a question that may question the current validity of the Constitution in this area, because it seems to me it may be a little outdated. You're asking for the Congress to make a decision on whether to go to war or authorize force. Mm-hmm. Yet we've got a time constraint. We can't wait until the speed of Congress catches up with that decision. Mm-hmm. And secondly, we have an intelligence issue, because all the congressmen are not going to know all the facts, and even if they did and had to express them on the floor of the Congress or in a committee, some of our intelligence would be compromised. So how do you deal with that challenge?
Yep, great question. And I will say, Randy, your point about, well, maybe the constitutional allocation 1787 doesn't work in 2014, and I think that's a fair point to consider. Washington has that great address that he wrote when he was leaving as president, his advice to the nation. And, he famously put in there some great advice, and one of his, we ought to avoid entanglements. Don't get involved in treaties. Don't have a requirement to defend anybody else other than the U.S. And that was the thinking of the day, but by Teddy Roosevelt, the thinking had changed, and now we were a global nation. Woodrow Wilson made it more so. So the U.S.'s role in the world is different. The two oceans don't make us isolationists anymore. We're all globally connected. So I think it is fair to ask the question of, is the original allocation of power still serve? But since the original allocation of power, to me, is based on this value, don't put people in harm's way if there's not a consensus that the mission is worth it, I still think actually that it's the right value. So we have to have a process that respects the intel that you describe and that also requires prompt action. But remember, the president can always take action to defend the nation from an imminent threat without even going to Congress. Any president can do that. Everybody in Congress realizes it. If there's an imminent threat on the nation, the president can act without Congress. The president loops back and gets Congress to support it later, but the president always has this power. So let's use ISIL as an example. The president thought ISIL was about to take the U.S. Embassy or the consulate in Erbil, which he did originally. That was when he started on August 8th. He can take action without Congress. If the president thinks ISIL poses a threat to the United States and there's an imminent threat of attack, and we would give the president some deference in deciding what imminent was, he could act without Congress. But when they have testified against ISIL, the national intelligence officials have testified they pose no imminent threat of attack on the United States, then they ought to have to get Congress. And they ought to have to get Congress even if it takes a while, if there's no imminent threat. Once there's an imminent threat, it's different. But if there's no imminent threat, what's the rush? Now, the bill that Senator McCain and I have in does have some tight time deadlines for congressional action. If the president comes and says, I got to do this, then tight time deadlines that can't be extended or triggered. But remember, the president can always rebut an imminent threat. And if there's not an imminent threat, we shouldn't feel rushed. We should do it right.
Left side, left center.
Good afternoon, Senator. My name is John Kamek from Chesterfield. And my question is a little bit of a follow-up on the drone attacks.
Yeah.
And more specifically, since we're not technically at war, and what is your position on the administration's targeted killings of at least what they've admitted to of 4 Americans, which appears to be in violation of the Constitution's Bill of Attainder, Article 1, Section 9, and the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm happy, the emotional side of me is happy that the terrorists are dead, but the rational side, like you've said, is we're a nation of laws. And the thought of an executive branch being judge, jury, and executioner should be very frightening to Americans. It would be analogous to you when you were governor getting together with your attorney general and deciding somebody is guilty of a crime and executing them without a judicial process. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So the 2 cases, you mentioned 4, the 2 cases that are the most known are Anwar al-Awlaki and his son. And I'm going to just focus on those 2, just to use those as an example. An American who went to Yemen and became connected in a very, willingly joined the enemy, in my view. He became an enemy combatant. He was a United States citizen, that's true. But in my view, when he chose to become an enemy combatant, then he was subject to the rules of war. And the drone strikes were carried out pursuant to an authorization that under its narrowest reading said we can take action against al-Qaeda. And he was part of an al-Qaeda affiliate, willingly joined, carrying out significant activities to further al-Qaeda. I have read the legal memo that tracked the justification for the al-Awlaki drone strike. Well, the one that I read wasn't. Yeah, I read it in a skiff, and I can assure you it wasn't redacted.
Senator Privileges.
Yeah. But what I will say is I was convinced that this was an individual who had become an enemy combatant, and the laws of war applied to him. I'm more troubled about the situation with respect to his son. He has a 17-year-old son who had been taken by his dad there too. The evidence of the son's, and even if the son did have some active intent, 17-year-olds do nutty things, and especially if they're under the domineering influence of a father who was a terrorist, in my view. And so there was an action later, not in the same instance, but a later action where this youngster was killed, without, in my view, at least to my satisfaction yet, sufficient evidence that this should have been somebody that was on the enemy combatant list. So I didn't have a difficulty with the 01 authorization being used against an al-Qaeda member, which is what Anwar al-Awlaki had become. I do have trouble. I do have concerns about the use of that same rationale on his son. And there was somebody who was a minor functionary, I think, in the press office at the White House, who made a very flip and, in my view, very outrageous comment when he was asked about it. He said, well, you shouldn't have a terrorist for a dad. That is entirely uncalled for, was entirely uncalled for. We don't choose who our moms and dads are. And there's no sins of the fathers are carried out on the next generation. There shouldn't be that in war, and there's definitely not that in the criminal justice system. So anyway, that's 2 of the cases.
To your right, slightly behind you. Yes, sir.
My name is...
Thank you.
My name is Balin Forcier of Richmond.
Balin.
In defining war and its abstractions away from the traditional state role, how do you address the abstractions in our own war processes? And then how do you address congressional war power when Eisenhower noted the loss of it?
The loss of? Congressional power. Yeah. So Eisenhower, I'm assuming you're referring to his great speech about the military-industrial complex. Yeah. As kind of having a momentum of its own that becomes nearly unstoppable in Congress. I will say this. The congressional dynamic vis-a-vis the military leadership is highly different today than it was when Eisenhower was president. When Eisenhower was president, you had people like, one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the Air Force advocating use of nuclear weapons all the time. President Kennedy became president and realized there was this ongoing, incredibly wacky, harebrained plan to do the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. And Kennedy felt completely buffaloed by the military. They were pushing him into it, and he was too new in the job, and he didn't feel steady enough on his feet to say, knock it off, we're not doing that. And he learned a sad, tragic, but important lesson in that, which is don't let the military buffalo you into doing things that you shouldn't be doing. My experience on the Armed Services Committee from 2013 to today, just for 2 years, is it is not the military today that is leading a drumbeat to more military action. The military is in a very different position. They will recommend it if they think it's necessary, but, is it, Adria? Your point about we should have learned some lessons after 13 years, we're entitled to learn some lessons. We're entitled to do some soul searching. And the military's done a bunch of soul searching. Remember, as General Powell said about Iraq, it's the Pottery Barn rule. If you break it, you pay for it. He warned against going into Iraq. And a lot of the military believes deeply that military power used wrong is the worst thing for the country and the worst thing for the military. So that's the kind of second half of your question. But the first half was? The war processes, abstraction. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, so is it just too easy? Is it just too easy to wage war by sending somebody dressed like me into a windowless conference room in Nevada and have them manipulate a joystick like it's a video game that you would play at the mall? I mean, it's just so abstract. So this is kind of back connected to the drone question, and there are other processes as well. Yeah. So, but again, I don't think the systems. I do not believe currently that the systems create a rush to military action. And maybe it's because of the time I'm serving. I only came in 2013, so I came in 12 years into a really long war, where I see our military guys coming to committees and telling us we ought to be spending more money on international development. The USAID should have a bigger budget. The Peace Corps should have a bigger budget. The military they're better advocates for the State Department and USAID than State Department and USAID are. So I do feel like some of the military over, kind of zealous attitude that Eisenhower was warning against, that Kennedy got buffaloed by in the Bay of Pigs, I think that's changed. Not that it won't be a problem in 5 years, but right now we're not in that moment. No, I'm aware of them. I don't see the military pushing it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the last thing I'll say about that, I'm on the budget committee too, and so it is the case. If we're trying to deal with a $7 trillion deficit, and we have to deal with spending issues, and defense is one of the largest items, and there are other big ones too. Nobody can be immune from analysis and finding savings and efficiencies and questions about do we really need to spend on that. And so one of the challenges, Tom, being the senator from Virginia, is you want to advocate for your state, but at the same time you do want to be fiscally sound and deal with the deficit, and defense is part of that. At the end of the day, the way you deal with that is, okay, let's be fiscally smart, but if we're going to make cuts, let's make the right ones, not the wrong ones. Congress in the summer of 2011 embraced this notion of the sequester, where basically it's across-the-board cuts. Now you protect some core warfighting and you protect Medicare and Medicaid, but everything else just gets an across-the-board cut. That's ridiculous. Because who thinks we spend too much money today on cybersecurity? No, we spend too little money on cybersecurity. But the cyber aspect has got to take the same cut of, the the regulation of salmon, you know. So you shouldn't be doing across the boards. We can deal with expense issues and even find savings on the defense side, and we have, and we can find more, but we shouldn't do it with a blunt instrument. We should be careful about how we do it.
Got time for 2 questions before I end at 2 o'clock. One over here, one over here.
Thank you. Norman Elliott is my name. And Senator, because you're such a loyal party man, I must say I was pleasantly surprised by your statesmanlike opposition, since you're such a friend to the president. And when you oppose his use of the authorization to use military force, I first observed this statesmanlike quality when you were a city councilman, and I thank you for maintaining and maturing that quality. And just for a moment of levity here, I have a picture from the Times-Dispatch here of you back in 2002.
Oh my gosh, I
that
don't
shows
see it.
that
Show it to everybody else. I'm not looking.
That statesmanlike smile. The devil just happens to be in the picture. He's not with the Senate. He attends city council quite regularly.
Why were you keeping that?
I love the picture.
Okay.
I love the picture. Okay. I'm also a supporter and an admirer of our troops and veterans, and want to be one of the reasonable voices of loyal dissent who opposes this endless cycle of war and intrusive surveillance that is undermining our great nation. To that end, I'd like to propose a plan to the Democratic Party for an innovative 21st century initiative that makes the politics of gridlock unappealing and shows how extreme partisanism is the cunning foe to democracy that it is. Can you help me present this plan?
I have got 2 or 3 staffers with me, so as soon as we're done, walk up and hand it to me, and we'll follow up. Thank you, Norman.
One final question, because we're contained for time. Yes,
Senator Dan Sullivan, you brought up entangling alliances. Do the treaties constitute authorization?
Yes.
There's no transition at any point where they
thank you for asking that. I left that out.
And I have another one.
Yeah, okay.
In the interim, proportionate response. Is a kinetic response proportionate to a cyber attack?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 2 questions were treaties, how do they fit in, and then proportionate response. And you could ask that about ISIL. They're doing certain things. We're taking a response. Is the response the right response? Is it a proportionate one? And that proportionate response issue comes up all the time. Hamas decided to escalate rocket attacks on Israel. Israel had a right to defend itself, and it did. They had the right to defend itself, and they did what we would do, but it was what Hamas wanted them to do. So the question is, when you're doing what your opponent wants you to do, you may have the legal right to do it, but strategically, is there a better way to come at it? And we have to tackle that with ISIL. ISIL found fertile ground in Iraq because the Maliki government in Iraq ran it by, for, and of the Shias, kicked the Sunnis aside, oppressed the Kurds, and so then ISIL moved into Iraq, and those guys wouldn't rally to protect Iraq, protect the Iraqi government, because they weren't being represented. So military force cannot accomplish the mission, even proportional military force sometimes, if you're not trying to grapple with what the causes are. So that is really important. But on the treaty question, Dan, I'm glad you mentioned that, because how does Congress authorize war? So, and we've asked a question, a declaration of war, authorization for use of military force. Sometimes Congress hasn't done it either, but they voted for a budgetary allocation. That's a congressional support for a military action. But another way Congress supports presidential war activity, or the initiation of war, is through a treaty. So if there is a treaty that we've entered into, NATO is the best example. We've entered into a mutual defense treaty where if Putin invades Ukraine, Ukraine's not a NATO ally. We're not obligated to defend Ukraine. If Putin invades Poland, Poland is a NATO ally. We are obligated to defend Poland by our NATO alliance. And that treaty was ratified by Congress. I wasn't there when it was ratified, but that is a congressional authorization. So the president could take, whether it might be a good idea to bring Congress into it, but a president can take military action pursuant to a treaty that Congress has ratified and say, no, Congress did have the opportunity to vote on this, and Congress agreed. And that's why Washington warned against treaties in the 1790s, but we live in a different world today, and really beginning with Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, we moved into, we're not an island nation, we're a global leader nation. So fantastic questions and some good ideas coming out of it. So thanks, and Tom, thanks for having me today.
You gave us the history, you gave us the politics, you gave us some solutions. What's the closing comment?
Well, I mean, I thank you for coming. I feel like, well, you know, you're feeding into my obsession. I am obsessed with this. I am obsessed with this. We've gotten it so wrong for so long, and there's been such an enormous negative consequence to us for doing this the wrong way that, to me, it just seems obvious that we would want to get it right. And that if we had a clearer norm that we could rely on to discuss, debate, and ultimately vote on these tough matters, the nation would be better off. And now, again, it's a hard slog to convince a number of my colleagues. And the funny thing is, again, while I've had some testy interaction with some on the administration side on this, and you thanked me for being willing to battle with a president who I consider a good friend, it's really much more about the congressional side, the Article I branch and the Article II branch. And that really needs fixing. The good news is we can do it. It's not partisan. The people who are supporting this effort, working with me, all parties, and it would be a great thing for Congress and a great thing for this president if we could make headway on this tough issue over the course of the next year or two. So anyway, thanks so much.
Senator Kaine, thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you very much for answering the questions of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And for proving you can always come home even if you were a former city council member. Thanks very much, everybody. Look out for the next Public Square. Thanks again.